Mr. Pop.
Hell would feel more like a spa. Jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those keepers? Makes us weepers every single night. Where'd you get that eye? Does it even cry? Why do I even try? Good evening, my fellow Wastelanders. This is DJ Pony. Ow! Reporting to you live from the doghouse. Looks like I might have pushed my luck a bit too far last time. 10 Pony Management was not happy to have heard the voice of the Ghoul Dr. Greenshift being transmitted from their tower. Poor Homage was startled by our proactive security personnel when they showed up to apprehend the lovable bag of bones. But, guessing that this might happen, I made sure to have the interview with our glowing guest from Dusselhof recorded earlier, since there was no evidence of him actually having been here. There was simply nothing they could do. By the time I was done broadcasting the interview, I had received a very professional-looking cease and desist letter posted on my door. It had the fancy letterhead and everything. Now, you may be asking yourself, wow, DJ Pony, how do you get away with these shenanigans? Well, my lovely listening audience, while they may hear me as some loudmouth buck with too much time on my hooves, I actually do a lot of good for 10 Pony Tower and its residents. Besides spinning the discs that get them swinging like the world never ended, my arrangement here comes with quite a few perks. You see, I have a natural aptitude at using a little thing called the magic of friendship, so when I've stepped on one too many tails, I can usually phone a friend to help me out of a jam. And this friend just so happens to be my next guest for Confessions of a Wasteland Pony. So, why don't I introduce her? Please welcome Rose Petal, the Duchess of Manchester.
Thank you, DJ Pony. It is lovely to be here.
The Duchess is one of the most gifted designers of pre-war fashion and architecture that the Wasteland is blessed with. She is also much too beautiful to be limited to a medium like radio.
Always the smooth talker. You already have me in your studio. Stop trying so hard.
Sorry about that, folks. I think my heart just skipped a beat. Whew. The Duchess has visited 10 Pony Tower a few times over the years, when she would make seasonal visits to sell her incredibly gorgeous dresses. Homage has emptied out our spare cap supply more than once on a ballroom gown.
The dear is just so adorable at fancy occasions. She's usually the first one, swinging like the world never ended. Perhaps if you came out of the shadows more, you'd have some fun too.
Now, you see, there's a reason I stick to radio. No pony wants to see this ugly mug. Plus, I did attend one of the winter galas a few years ago. We even danced. It was very nice.
Yes, a masquerade ball. That hardly qualifies.
What can I say? I like being a Mustang of mystery. Now, why don't we get back to you? After years of short visits, I have finally convinced Duchess Rose to settle down to make 10 Pony Tower her new home and her new project. Given enough time, she'll have this place looking better than it did before the war.
He can be very persuasive, but I am looking forward to the restoration. This place is an impressive body of work from the Neo-Deco era. I appreciate the late Mr. 10 Pony's tastes. It is a travesty to see the jewel of his business empire left in such shambles. These marble walls deserve to shine again.
So are we still friends, 10 Pony? I promise the first thing to be restored will be the fountain in the lobby, and Homage and I believe we're closer to establishing an off-site broadcasting station. We're just waiting to hear back from another friend. So, until then, we have an interview with not only an artisan of utmost class in society, but a member of a bona fide royal family. Duchess, please tell us about yourself.
Well, I was born in what is now called New Manchester. We have slowly been restoring our home since recolonizing it from the depths of Stable 79. Well, not depths. Stable 79 isn't Tartarus. It's just utilitarian, a function of a style. It still proves to be useful as a power source, hospital, and a few other city essentials that New Manchester relies on it for.
So you've traveled a ways to be here then?
Well, I've been travelling the Wasteland since my early 20s. But yes, Manchester is about 200 miles northeast of here, in the Sea of Faust.
You're starting to sound more like a courier than a trader. Nor land, nor sea, nor mutants, nor Tane can stop you.
Oh, hush. We do, thankfully, have a ferry. I'm not about to swim the channel towing a trunk of supplies and merchandise.
Something tells me you could manage it if you wanted to.
Well, a lady must know how to handle herself.
So, Rose Petal, how did you come by such an illustrious title like the Duchess of Manchester? It isn't self-assigned, is it? Because if so, I'd like to be known as Mr. President DJ Pony from now on.
While I could see some would think that, Mr. President, my title does actually have a place in history. My family's nobility dates back almost 2,500 years.
Wow, that's longer than 3 or 4 standing governments. Pretty impressive.
It has been easy to keep track of. My family has always been very regardful of history, especially our own. We've been archiving it meticulously from the very beginning. Since childhood, that was one of the many virtues instilled in me, one that everyone in my family was expected to carry. With every age and every season, we are nothing if not the legacy of days past. That was the tenet, the ideology of my upbringing. It all began with my oldest recorded ancestor, Okrut the Silent. He was a founder and a member of the First Chamber of Nine. The Chamber of Nine was a parliamentary government which united the tribal races of the Foggy Isles. Okrut's children would eventually establish the township of Manchester, which became the capital and new namesake of one of the 9 member islands.
All this talk of starting governments is going to inspire some more crackpots to set up their own little dictatorships. Because it's not like we don't have enough of those already.
I'll say, far too many ponies care more about the crown than they do the country.
Especially when you're stitching a country together from a bunch of smaller tribes. So, besides keeping tabs on your family tree, what was life like on the island?
Well, Manchester, like many of the other tribes of the Foggy Isles, were predominantly unicorn culture, specializing in runic magics.
Runic magics? You mean like carving a bunch of symbols into a wall and being able to create magic from it?
You're mostly right, except for the very essence of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You see, runes don't create magic. Ironically, it'd be more accurate to say that they pull it out of thin air.
You're gonna have to explain.
Magic isn't something that's created. It's all around us. It's part of every living being, in every object. It circles the earth in ley lines of concentrated energy. And although it is one energy, it can manifest in so many different ways, different spectrums that certain creatures can be more connected to than others. Pegasi, for instance, are sensitive to a particular spectrum that allows them to fly and interact with clouds. That's the thing so many don't understand. We are all creatures of magic.
So then, what makes unicorns different?
Well, even though we're surrounded by this energy, unicorns have a natural catalyst that allows them to access it more easily than others. In its most basic form, unicorns have the ability to manifest that energy so that the magic controls the object it's flowing through. This is what we call telekinesis, using magic to manipulate the physical world. That's the common spectrum most unicorns have access to. In fact, in many cases, telekinesis is the only kind of magic a unicorn can use.
You know, you're starting to sound like the Ghoul Doctor. Should I be taking notes, Professor?
Oh, don't get snippy with me. You're the one who asked.
Okay, I suppose you're right. So, runes just pull magic out of whatever wall they're scribbled on?
In a way, but I have a better analogy. Creating a rune spell is like painting a picture. You flip on a light bulb and spend hours painting and arranging the colors on a canvas in every way you like. Then, once you're done, you turn off the light bulb. Now, for anyone else to see what you did, all they have to do is turn on the light for a moment and observe all of its detail and beauty. Runic spells are the same. You put in a massive amount of magical energy at the start, which are the hours running the light bulb to paint it. Then crafting the spell is arranging the colors into the picture. Turning on the light bulb to view the painting is the spark it takes to trigger the spell.
Okay, I think I understand.
That's the way magic was taught to me, at least. The way we treat it in Manchester. It's not perfect truth, it's just the way we've learned to interpret this energy that surrounds us. If it were easy to understand, they wouldn't call it magic. It's just the way things appear to me. Really, that's all I can give you, my own experience. Tell you how I see the world, and hope it helps somebody.
Now that's what this show is all about.
And Manchester has built a large part of its culture out of this discipline. In fact, we introduced many new kinds of runic magic to the rest of unicorn kind when the Chamber of Nine officially annexed and became a part of Equestria. One such kind of magic, called Stone Script, was a key component in the development of the spell matrix operating language that many of these pre-war terminals still use to this day.
Talk about coming full circle, I'm feeling smarter already. For a town with such an accomplished contribution to pony society, why did you end up leaving?
Well, I still visit quite often, but once reaching marehood, I felt like I'd contributed all I could to New Manchester. She lies in the capable hooves of my cousin, Duke Highwater. I was never fond of leadership and governance anyway. I was more than happy that he chose to bear the responsibilities.
So, where did you plan on going?
I wasn't sure at the time. I just felt called, like my place and purpose were on the mainland. When I landed ashore, I began seeing how much greater the destruction was, and how it had only decayed further over time. Manchester and the other Foggy Isles suffered relatively little fallout by comparison. This is what confirmed for me how I could do my part for Equestria. I would do everything in my power to make her beautiful once again.
And you have the mark to show for it?
Why, sir, are you asking me to lift my dress?
Why, no, that's not what I meant. I just...
You silly colt. See?
It looks like, I'm assuming, your family crest.
A version of it, yes. The original crest was carved into a block of limestone by Oakroot himself. The red and gold colouring and the flourishes were added centuries later. However, the original limestone slab still exists to this day. It was set into one of the walls of Stable 79's atrium.
That must be quite a sight.
It is. Oakroot also engraved a simple spell around its border, so that the crest would glow a soft white in the dark.
It must be nice having such a physical tie to your past. There aren't many things like that left in the Wasteland.
Well, truth be told, the past is what finally drove me to go and explore Equestria.
Oh really? How so?
You see, it wasn't until adulthood that I began piecing together some less talked about records in our family archives. Remember when I said that our family was made of mostly unicorns?
Yes?
Well, genetics is a funny thing. Although the Foggy Isles were comprised mostly of unicorns, every once in a while an Earth Pony or Pegasus would be born anyway. Which was unfortunate for them, because our family's illustrious magical history with runes and incantations fostered a very strong unicorn bias over time.
How come? I thought you said that every creature is magical in its own way.
Magic flows through everything, but not all living things can access that energy in the same way. For most of our history, it was thought that only unicorns could create and cast runic spells, especially before we came in contact with other creatures and civilizations. Even a fully developed spell requires that spark to activate it, and it's something that Earth Ponies and Pegasi can't naturally do. Even back then, in the days of Oakroot, a bias towards unicorns was forming. They were the wizards, the spell masons, the ones who could command the forces of nature. They thought it was a natural gift, and that Earth Ponies and Pegasi were somehow cursed from birth by having this ability denied to them.
Wow, you can almost feel the love and acceptance from here.
Oh, things got worse. The bigotry soon gave birth to stories and superstitions that further tarnished them. One myth was called The Legend of the Chalice Stone. It told the story of an Earth Pony sorcerer who dabbled in some kind of dark arts to create a gemstone of pure magical energy. He then crushed the stone up into a chalice of wine and drank it. This elixir made him incredibly powerful, but being the villain, he slayed innocent women and children to maintain his power. He was only stopped by Oakroot's grandson, Stoneheart. The two dueled in a castle until Stoneheart cast a spell that ignited the sorcerer in a magical fire. The sorcerer was then thrown down a well which collapsed around him, forming his tomb.
Not exactly a bedtime story.
Not at all, but nonetheless it was read like one. Think about growing up as an earth pony in that culture. This continued on for centuries as my hornless ancestors lived out their days as second-class citizens, or even monsters in the eyes of the brothers and sisters. Then, after the Chamber of Nine became a part of Equestria, the shunned family members got word of the new movement of racial equality in the Princess's Kingdom. One night, during the annual Unity Festival, which celebrated the unification of the 9 islands, all of our Earth Pony and Pegasi relatives quietly slipped away during the fireworks display. A memoir from that day reflected, with every flash that dazzled the eye, another leaf did drop or fly. With final burst of evening light, a third the vine was gone from sight.
1/3 of your whole family? That's quite a loss. And sadly, the world is pretty far from a place of racial harmony. Or harmony at all, for that matter.
Things got better over time, but there was still a definite unicorn preference even in my own upbringing. It was the kind of thing you don't notice until you're old enough to pick up the subtext in the history books. It was hard for me to read through those accounts again. It tainted many of the views I held of my family and its past. But despite the sugar-coating, our histories reflect the event quite clearly. The group left as one to form their own settlement in the new motherland.
So, you left New Manchester to see if you could track down the remnants of that family line?
That was one of the reasons, yes. And it was very difficult because I had very little to go off of. Following that exodus, my ancestors had all but struck them from our scrolls and history books, casting them as ne'er-do-wells and bad seeds from the start. My family was only ever protective of history that showed us in the best light.
This must have been very hard to deal with, being torn between love and devotion to your family, but at the same time acknowledging their wrongs and mistakes.
Yes. I hoped, by tracking down the remains of that side of our family, I could begin a healing process, or at the very least a grieving process, to pay some of the penance that the unicorns of Manchester owed them.
So, once you reached the mainland, how did you begin your search?
I knew I needed to find historical records, immigration paperwork, census scrolls, something that would hopefully reveal where they had settled. I started seeking out old government buildings and libraries, picking through the ruins one at a time.
Were you out there on your own? There's no way that was safe.
Oh, it wasn't. I narrowly escaped slavers on several occasions. I searched the eastern half of the continent for months before I eventually found myself in a small village named Victo, founded under a propaganda billboard which once read, "Victory" in large letters.
Of course they named it after a billboard.
For the most part, it was just another highway-adjacent trading village. But it had one unique attraction. The main marketplace of the village was set up in the exposition hall of the Museum of Classical Arts. Once discovering this, I enjoyed the rest of the afternoon trotting through the exhibits and passing many vendors, much to their dismay. It was a pleasant break from my adventuresome first few months in the equestrian wasteland. There were many displays relating to turn-of-the-millennium fashion to appreciate, but soon I turned a corner and found myself in the musical section. Music is one art form that I unfortunately have no talent in whatsoever. Fashion and architecture I'm quite capable with, but I would perish if I was ever expected to hold a melody. I almost passed by the section completely, but changed my mind when I saw designs for classical theatres in one corner of the hall. So I went in. I was casually glancing at different information boards when the word Manchester caught my eye. I trotted closer to the display and began reading. It was about a composer, an instrument maker named Fortissimo. He was a Pegasus who had moved to a town in the south with his family from Manchester. Based on the chronology, everything lined up perfectly. These were my missing relatives.
Fantastic! A major breakthrough like that must have been very satisfying.
Oh, it was. The museum exhibit explained that they had pursued some kind of musical profession. After the immigration, they had become known as the Oratorio family. Through the generations, they spread all over Equestria, with many descendants adding to their illustrious musical lineage. One of the more famous ones around the time of the Great War was a symphony mare named Amoria.
Fascinating. I didn't know Amoria came from such interesting roots, and I play her music all the time. It's good to hear that the Oratorio family despite their lack of magic, became successful in their own talents.
Yes, and they did not bear the biases of Manchester either. They married other unicorns and didn't seem to have treated their non-musical family members any differently. One of the Oratorios, exceptional at business, became an iron mining tycoon. While gaining fame from music, they were all allowed to live for themselves and were encouraged to follow their own dreams and passions. If only my ancestors had shared that worldview.
So, now that you knew who they were and what became of them, did you have any idea where they might be?
Thanks to the Museum of Classical Arts, I did have one lead. The family still owned a large plantation they had originally settled. It was a manor in the south called Maracello. I plugged my pip-buck into the information terminal and was able to download a map to its location. So, I gathered my things and headed there, hoping to discover more clues when I arrived. It took me a few weeks following rivers and railroad tracks, but I finally made my way down the countryside. Maracello was surrounded on all sides by several thousand acres of swamps and marshlands. I was surprised the Oratorios were able to grow anything of substance there, but I assumed it was just one of the many things which had changed for the worse after the war.
I can't even imagine what kind of monsters inhabit those swamps.
I had the good fortune not to meet any such creatures. Whatever lived in the swamps had the decency to leave me alone. I reached the main gates of the manor to find tall black iron bars lining the entire perimeter. The property looked its age, but was luckily untouched by any of the direct explosions of the bombs. Maracello was far from the nearest big city and fairly secluded, tucked away where it was. The iron bars reflected 200 years of neglect. The gate was a different story, though. Lying in a pile off to one side was the original chain, having been broken, discarded, and left to rust in the dust. The surprising thing to me was how the gate had been resecured. The center bars and hinges were bent and melted right into one another. They didn't have the same rust as the rest of the gate, which led me to believe it must have been done recently.
That sounds extreme. A different chain or lock could have been easily cobbled together, but at least it sounds like someone must have been inside.
And due to its remoteness from any other inhabited area of the Wasteland, my hope was high that I would find the Oratorios within. I stood at the gate a while, waving at the windows, whistling and calling as loud as I could, but to my dismay, I met with silence. The mansion was the epitome of antebellum architecture. There were tall white pillars supporting the roof's overhang across the entire front of the building. The sections that weren't red brick matched the white of the pillars, but the paint had chipped and peeled terribly over time, and many of the original grey shingles were scattered around the building, having been broken away by the weather. However, as it stood, the damage could have been much worse. While a few of the windows were cracked, none of them seemed to be broken out at all, and surprisingly, many of them remained intact. I wanted to get a closer look, and I was tired of waiting at the gate, so I decided to use a little magical encouragement. I magically etched a few runes into the largest of the welded metal masses that used to be the gate. With a small spark, the runes glowed a brilliant orange, then exploded into the property, presenting me with a nice pony-sized hole to enter through.
Sometimes it takes the direct approach.
Simple as it were, my walk to the building was slow as I pushed my way through the thick, untamed shrubs. The mutated flora had reclaimed the path and made my passing difficult, even with the machete and boots.
Boots? You mean you weren't dressed in your finest gown for the family reunion?
I am not so high society that I don't understand that Wasteland fashion must be functional as well as fabulous. Most of my travels were in short-length dresses with stockings and gorgeous yet durable high-lace boots.
Fair enough.
Besides, the weather down there in the marshland was horrendously humid. I needed clothing that could breathe. I finally reached the porch and the burgundy-red doors that stood beyond the white pillars. There was a door knocker on each of them fashioned into the shape of a hydra. I took hold of it and knocked 3 times. After waiting a few moments, I knocked again. But when I knocked the 3rd time, the door creaked open. I pushed it open all of the way, which required both hooves because of how heavy it was.
It was probably still easier than unjamming a pneumatic door.
Well, yes, but only slightly. As I walked inside, I was met with a breathtaking sight. This was the centuries-old home, the cornerstone of an illustrious musical family, and the decor matched appropriately. There were 2 sweeping staircases to either side of the center atrium, which circled up to the second floor. Grand chandeliers were hung with silver chains, matching the finely cut crystals. The ceiling itself was painted with elaborate scenes of ponies frolicking and singing. Wall murals reflected different achievements from famous oratorios. The mural farthest to the west showed a Moria performing at the Grand Royal Exposition in front of a crowd of 100,000. Pictures and other ornaments covered the soft lavender walls, the most prominently displayed items being instruments. Horns, harps, woodwinds, lyres, and strings were each hung with dignity beside a portrait of its owner and a candelabra.
It sounds like a museum in its own right.
Oh, it was, and an absolutely elegant one at that. However, the most distinguishing feature of all stretched forth from the heart of the manor, like the arms of a giant squid, the massive pipe organ. Its polished brass pipes spread like tendrils up the walls of the manor, encompassing the atrium. It was as if the mansion itself was a single, beautiful instrument.
That sounds incredible. I've been in radio a long time, but I don't think I've ever seen a pipe organ so big in person.
Oh, it was so well preserved. The wood was smooth with an oil-stained finish, and the pipes were still quite reflective, scattering the natural light from the windows. I sat down at the bench and ran my hooves over the keys, but they didn't make a sound. Then to the right of the console, I spotted a gold-plated lever. I pulled it and was startled by the spark when the metal made contact. I felt a gentle vibration from the bench seat accompanied by a faint hum as dust coughed out of the cutaways in the pipes. I pressed on one of the keys and shivered as a low B-note reverberated throughout the halls. I pressed a few more keys before the discordant sound started to wear on my senses. If only I were capable of making you sing, I said to the ivory slabs.
But at least that meant there was an active power source energizing the air compressors. Someone must have been maintaining the generator.
Which is what I figured as well. So if my horrendous musical renditions weren't signal enough, I began calling out again to see if anyone was there, but was met with silence. Not satisfied, I powered down the organ and decided to continue exploring the manor. Behind each of the 2 staircases was a closet door. I pressed down on the handles but found them to be locked. I gave them a few hard knocks, but they sounded like they had been double-bolted. I don't really have any lockpicking skills, despite being well-equipped in bobby pins, so I decided to just move on. I began walking the ground floor to see if I could find signs of anyone. The west wing contained the kitchen and dining areas. The main dining hall at the end was spacious enough to host over 100 guests. Surprisingly, all the fine dishes and silverware were still there. Nothing was raided, broken, or missing.
Really? I was going to say, if raiders had been there, I'd expect them to have at least taken some of the silverware or fine china. And speaking of fine china...
A few biscuits, with a cup of nice sunrise tea.
Why, thank you, dear. You're much too kind. I am quite parched. It feels like I've been talking forever.
You have to admit that you're probably the only pony in this tower that's chattier than I am.
Well, I would disagree, Mr. Nationwide Broadcast Audience.
But I don't do this for my health. I provide a service for all of the good ponies of the equestrian wasteland.
And a sparkle cola for you.
Laser lemon? We still had one of these?
You put it on my side of the fridge again.
Well, shoot, it must be my birthday. Wait, what about my biscuits?
Sorry, call dibs on the last ones.
Fine then. I wasn't hungry anyway. Which is getting harder to tell myself considering we were talking about a dining room.
Ah, yes. It looked as if it was ready to host a meal as well. In fact, all of the tables had been set as if they were preparing to serve a dinner for one of the large family gatherings. The plates and wine glasses were sat empty, ready to be filled for guests. But they remained undisturbed through the passing of years, entertaining only dust and cobwebs. All except for one. The head seat of the center table had its chair pulled out, leaving streaks against the dust of the wood floor. There were faint hoofprints near the table which circled the room and ended at the carpeted hallway. "Hello," I said, calling out over the empty chairs, but of course was met with no response.
So they hadn't taken anything? Maybe that means they had planted roots in the manor.
I didn't know, but my hopes were waning. Even with the hoofprints, enough dust had resettled that they were surely long gone. Feeling deflated, I proceeded over to the east wing, passing the organ again. These hallways contained all of the guest bedrooms. Most of them had some kind of luggage and travel supplies. It looked like quite a few family members were there, visiting before the bombs fell. But none of them had been lived in for some time. I continued circling the wing until I found myself at the organ again, so I proceeded upstairs. By this point, I had given up on the idea of finding anyone at all. The mansion seemed long abandoned. I started with the east wing this time. Again, I found mostly bedrooms, but these were much more decorated and personalized. Clearly, they had belonged to the family members who lived at Maracello. Soon, I noticed one of them had a terminal, although I had to look twice at it. It didn't look like any terminal I'd ever seen before. I sat down, tapped on the keys, and was bathed in a gentle blue light. The logo and styling of the screen were quite different from the familiar green Stapletech logo.
I don't think I've ever seen a terminal that wasn't made by Stapletech.
Neither had I. Instead, the home screen was branded with the name East Corp.
East like the direction?
Exactly. It was an odd interface to use, but once I got past the aesthetic differences, it was familiar enough. It was a simple, personal console with an email left open. Dear Harpsichord, I apologize again that I was not able to make this year's fall festival. I've been held up in New York because of a recent bomb scare. They shut down all the trains leaving the city and most of the subways as well. Almost nothing is open. I've been cooped up in my hotel room while the ministry is investigating. Ugh, it's driving me stir-crazy. Thanks a lot, 4 Stars Rail. I do hope Crescendo isn't too upset. I was looking forward to playing with him at the family concert. His newest organ piece sounds beautiful, and it's been much too long since I've been back home. I want to hear more about this stallion you've mentioned. I'll try calling you next week. Send my love to the others. Amoria.
It sounds like they were all still very close.
They were. It seemed like no matter how far the Oratorios moved, they remained in contact with one another. Having an annual reunion must have really helped hold them together as a family. However, Amoria's email did not intrigue me as much as the unsent response. Oh, Amoria, it was so nice to hear from you. Truth be told, it's probably better that you were not here. I didn't want to dampen your spirits because I do wish more than anything that you were here, but I've been dreading this year's fall festival. My father has not been well lately. I expect to have to calm him down off of one of his tirades at the big dinner. Heaven knows no one else will say a word. But it's more than just his usual temper. I think the war has been upsetting him more than any of us anticipated, and we've been dealing with the consequences. This last year has been a series of fights and bad situations as he's been having his big surprise prepared for everyone to see. At least it's given Mother and I an excuse to sample more of our wine stocks. Regardless, it would probably be better if we talked about this over the phone. I'd much like to call you after tonight's concert if you're free. I'd be more than happy to save you from the boredom if you'd save me from this weekend. Talk to you soon. Much love, Hopsy. And that's where the letter stopped, in the middle of her name, as if she were called away from the console before she could send it.
How strange.
I was about to shut down the terminal when I noticed a few sound files they had sent back and forth to one another, including some of Amoria's songs and the organ piece she had mentioned. Curious to hear the samplings, I plugged my pipbook into the console to download them.
Hold on. If you're going to give me new Amoria songs, you might just become my new best friend. Same goes for the rest of you Wastelanders. If you come across any music in your travels, you just bring DJ Pony a copy, and I'll be sure to broadcast them for all to hear.
Well, I'm afraid in my case you're going to be disappointed. My pipbook was only plugged in for a few seconds when sparks started shooting out from both sides of the cable. My pipbook screen turned the same blue coloring before I unplugged it. One final arc of electricity erupted from the gap and melted away part of the terminal's casing and slot. Had I left it in any longer, I feared it would have done the same to me.
Yikes. Talk about not playing well with others. I've heard of faulty terminals, but those are usually rigged as exploding traps, because the wasteland is full of dear hearts and gentle ponies.
Well, luckily it didn't turn me into a rose salad.
So, now that you were done with the terminal, and it was done with you, what happened next?
Well, I continued out of Harpsichord's room and passed by a few others. Many of them had the same blue East Corp terminals, but none of them contained anything of interest. I continued walking down the east wing hallway when I heard a loud slam behind me. Startled, I spun around quickly while magically drawing my carbine rifle. But as I aimed down its iron sights, I didn't see anything there. It was just the same dust floating in the hallway. I crept slowly towards the origin of the sound, passing by all the rooms again. That's when I found that Harpsichord's bedroom door had been shut, and not by me. I opened it slowly and peered back inside. No one was there, and the window was closed. I crept up to look inside the open closet, but was met with only dresses and shoes. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a purple glow. Spinning around again, I saw a small fire crackling out of the back of the terminal, casting a flickering light against the lavender wall. Using one of the coats from the closet, I smothered the flames, but with the terminal extinguished, I still noticed a flickering on the wall. I glanced around again until I noticed a scented candle on the nightstand by the bed. The small flame danced by itself, while a pleasant fresh linen aroma filled the room. However, the candle was on the other side of the room from the terminal, and I hadn't lit it because I didn't know it was there. I checked under the bed and around the room one last time, still finding nothing. As I left, I shut the door myself, and all the other doors I'd opened as well.
Perhaps you'd finally found the pony that had been in the dining room?
I didn't know, but the incident left me flustered, so I kept my carbine at the ready just in case. At the end of the hallway, I opened the last door to find the master bedroom. It was a very luxurious suite with a large bed in the center. Above the headboard was a family portrait showing 6 earth ponies. The 4 at the bottom were the children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. They were dressed in their finest as though they were off to attend a wedding or grand gala. The youngest daughter, to the bottom right, was Harpsichord. She was a lovely young mare in her late 20s. She had an orange mane and tail with a hazel coat, all brought together with green almond-shaped eyes. Standing above them was the patriarch of the family. He was an aged stallion, possibly in his 60s, with a grey coat. His mane and tail turned white with age, matching a well-groomed moustache. His eyes were a sharp reddish-brown. This was Crescendo, standing proudly with his wife and children. They looked happy enough as a family, posing in front of the grand pipe organ. I didn't know what could have unhinged Crescendo so much as to distress Harpsichord and the others. Then again, the picture could have been older. The walls behind the organ were white as opposed to the lavender that now covered the house. Even still, I wanted to know what this big surprise was that he had been working on. How could a caring father let himself become so twisted up in something that he would lose control of his temper? Then I caught myself while standing there pondering. I hadn't realized it at first, but I had been walking the manor for several hours. I was growing invested in them, this, my missing family, who were driven away by crueler ancestors. I wanted to get to know them as much as I could, because, with every age and every season, we are nothing if not the legacy of days past.
That's very true. It must have meant a lot to you.
I was still embracing it all, but it was hard to take in a moment for a different reason. The master bedroom looked as though it had been claimed. On one of the tables sat some supplies and food provisions, which were clearly recent post-war additions to the suite. Next to them sat a box of these very strange batteries, a kind I had not seen before. Gathered around the bed were a variety of other items some travelers had set up and were apparently living there. The only item on the bed was an Instashot camera. And let's just say, the photos revealed why the sheets were in such a disheveled state.
Oh! Well, that's something you don't come across every day.
Oh yes, they were quite explicit. It seemed the settlers were a mare and stallion couple. One thing I noticed them wearing, because it was the only thing they were wearing, were pip-bucks. They must have come from a stable somewhere.
Stable 69, perhaps?
Well, that would be a good guess. They sure hadn't held back. There were several empty wine bottles scattered about as well, all of them with Maracello labels. Regardless, I Figured they wouldn't have just left all the supplies behind. It looked like almost everything they could carry was still sitting in the master bedroom. For all I knew, they probably stumbled upon the manor in their travels and decided to celebrate the find by breaking in the queen-sized bed.
I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't probably do the same thing as well.
They had definitely made themselves comfortable, and apparently fallen prey to the same mistake as me. In one corner of the room was another one of the East Corp terminals, this one a bit larger than harpsichords. But unlike harpsichords, which I had effectively destroyed, the screen was still glowing in active blue, despite the obvious burn mark around the access port.
Oftentimes, larger really is better.
The terminal didn't survive unscathed, however. The main directory was a collection of nonsense, as most of the files had been corrupted by the failed interaction. There were luckily a few emails and journal entries still legible enough. From what I was able to read, it seemed Crescendo sat on the board of directors for several companies of his day. All of them seemed to be corporations founded by oratorios at one point or another. They had been kept in the family throughout the years, and all seemed to respect Crescendo's cunning and business acumen. One of the few surviving journal entries that didn't relate to work was much more disturbing. The language is not at all ladylike, but I feel to censor the words would detract from the understanding of who he was.
It doesn't bother me, and I'm pretty sure most Wastelanders are used to foul speech just from walking past raider nests.
Indeed. Well, following some corrupted characters at the beginning, the entry read as follows. I should have known. Those stupid, money-grubbing, stable-tech fucks. You need a justifiable interest for me to want to have a stable to keep my family safe? I could give a damn what stable is designated for my region. I don't buy your horse shit for 1 second. I'm not even surprised. Knowing how many of their people come from Manchester and their debased runic magics sparking away in their technology, I never trusted them before, and I was a fool to think they'd be anything different. It doesn't matter. You think you hold power over us? That your bigotry can deny my family's safety from a war you had a hoof in? Well, you don't. I will protect my family from the twilight of our civilization. I will see that they live through the balefire, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice. We will survive.
Well then, at least he's not bitter.
No, he really wasn't. Because it wasn't bitterness I read in his words. It was hatred. A deep-seated hatred that had lasted through the centuries. Their hearts were still broken from the injustices Manchester had wrought upon them. One prejudice had simply given birth to another.
It might not have been like that for all of them. Even if some of them held grudges, I'm sure most of the others had forgiven and moved past it.
Perhaps. Or maybe he was just the most vocal of them. There wasn't much else on the terminal. I decided to go back out into the hallway and over to the west wing of the second floor. It was the only part of the main manor I hadn't visited yet. I took one of the strange batteries with me, looking it over as I walked. The hallways themselves left an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I could understand family reverence to an extent, but passing by dozens of oratorios staring out from their picture frames was, in a word, creepy.
Yeah, not exactly the place I'd go on vacation.
Once I reached the end of the hallway, I opened the double doors to discover another familiar sight, a large library. Even after centuries of separation, the oratorios seemed to contain the same devotion to history as our family in Manchester. Of course, being a history of musicians, there were quite a few vinyl records and holotapes shelved alongside the books.
None of which you grabbed along the way, did you?
Sorry, no, I don't have a secret reserve of music hoarded from an adventure I had over a decade ago.
I know, but it's a library of musicians. You're killing me over here.
Oh, I'll make it up to you. How about something a little more comfortable for this drab grey studio space?
Well, since you put it so nicely.
Anyway, the inside of the library was gorgeous, fitting with the rest of the mansion's decor. An observation window covered the entire west wall, looking out over a swampy, mutated plantation. A strange light shone through the window from the horizon, pouring over the reading area from the orange-coloured sky. It was nearly sunset. It seemed I would be staying the night at Maracello.
And there was still no sign of the two travelers?
Not in the library. Only the tomes and recordings of hundreds of ponies recanting their achievements and accomplishments, including, on the far north wall, the records of a very familiar branch of my family tree, Oakroot the Silent.
You're kidding me. They still kept a chronology of his life? I would have thought that, given the circumstances, they would have completely separated themselves from their Manchester roots.
As did I, but there he was. His name and section sat below the familiar image of him I'd seen 1,000 times in my youth. It was a portrait that was made several centuries after his death. He lived in an age when most of his neighbours were still warring tribes, conquering each other's islands with axes and wooden ships. The artist's impression of him had been based on several cruder drawings from his day and the descriptions given by those who knew him. He stood tall, nearly 6 feet high. He carried a strong presence about him for many reasons, not the least of which was his imposing stature. He had a chocolate-brown coat with dark emerald eyes. His grey, shaggy mane and beard blew gently in the breeze as he looked out over the ivory cliffs, a simple, earthy green cloak draped over him. It brought a tear to my eye, seeing his face in such an unlikely place.
He sounds like a great stallion.
He was. Their collection held many of the same books we had, while missing several of the ones that had been written about him after the fact. In fact, the only writings not authored by him were those penned while he was still alive, or shortly thereafter. Much of the expansions and developments the unicorns of Manchester had made to his works were simply omitted.
So it seems the respect started and ended with Oakroot.
Yes, which left the collection very limited. Oakroot earned his title the Silent because he spoke very little. So little, in fact, that even in his soft, almost harsh tone, everyone immediately took notice and listened when he did say something. His writings were no different. His original scrolls totaled not more than a few dozen pages each, but every word was profound and carefully chosen. As such, his entire philosophy on runes, governance, magic, and society totaled a mere 12 works. However, every Filian cult in Manchester grew up studying them in every detail.
Well, at least the chapters are short.
However, as I looked over the bindings, I came across a 13th tome, on Race, Equality, and Magic, by Oakroot, 1st Regent, Kingdom of Manchester. I was dumbfounded, staring at this deuteronomical text. Another writing by Oakroot? Why had I never seen this before? I took it with me to one of the couches and began reading while bathed in the evening light. At first, I felt this must be a fraud, an uncanonized work attributed to him after the fact. But the more I read, the more I was convinced it was indeed penned by Oakroot. His writing had a very distinct voice to it. His ideas flowed like the wind passing around trees in a forest. Only when leaving the forest do you realize they were all part of the same tree. This was an incredible find because Oakroot's writings were essentially the cornerstone of our civilization. The Foggy Isles lived by these edicts and philosophies for over a millennia. Even under the princesses of Equestria, they formed an important part of our history and culture, which is why the discovery of this 13th work was so devastating to me. On Race, Equality, and Magic was Oakroot's treatise on why he ever took interest in runic magic in the first place. For him, it went far beyond a curiosity or thirst for arcane discovery. Runic magic was how he thought he could bring true equality between all races of ponies. It was a way to give magic to earth ponies and Pegasi beyond what was naturally available to them. He had grandiose ideas for artificial wings and horseshoes so that earth ponies and unicorns could walk on clouds and fly like the Pegasi. They were not ideas I was reading for the first time, but it was the first time I was hearing them come from Oakroot. The Foggy Isles had not taken this approach to runic magic at all. From the very beginning, most of the writings and studies were pursuing ways to augment the magic that unicorns already had. Unicorns were the majority of the population, so to an extent it made sense. But there I discovered that Oakroot's reason for the whole pursuit was to bring equality to the races, not further division. I had grown up assuming those kinds of magics led to dead ends, that only unicorns had the capability to interact with runes, in the same way that only Pegasi can interact with clouds, and the unicorns of Manchester seemed to prefer it that way, hence the stories of earth ponies being demons and sorcerers. But would that still be true if our society had shared in Oakroot's dream to pursue those discoveries? And furthermore, why was I only finding this work here, for the first time in a mansion of family members we had grown apart from over 1,000 years ago? Manchester had completely rejected the righteous endeavors of our greatest ancestor and used his accomplishments for our own selfish gain. It was then that I understood why Oakroot's picture was there. The Oratorios had known for 1,000 years that they were cast out despite the ideals of their forefather, our forefather. It was no wonder why they hated us, having this constant reminder that their shared birthright was stolen from them.
That would definitely cast a long shadow over their past. What an awful thing to discover.
Awful as it was also very empowering for me. I felt like I'd found the resolution I was searching for. The Oratorios might have been long gone, but with that book, I could go back and change Manchester for the better. I could truly make it a new Manchester to help us rise above what we once were.
And that is ultimately the reason to scavenge for things in the first place. We utilize the broken pieces of the past so that we can build ourselves a better future.
I felt very happy I could finally put the Oratorios to rest, at least in my mind. I decided I would stay in the master bedroom for the night and head out on the road in the morning. I left the reading area and walked back to Oakroot's section to look one more time to see if I'd missed anything else. I pushed the books to one side and another, but found nothing. So I packed the 13th book away in my saddlebag. Then I pressed all the books up against the right side to straighten them out, which rattled the picture frame. Oakroot's portrait was leaning slightly to one side, so I reached up and straightened it. It was then that I heard a metal click and watched as Oakroot's face was bathed in shadow. The edges of the sunset were receding away from the frame. I stepped back, startled, until the section of wall had completely slid inward, revealing a hidden doorway.
A hidden doorway? Did it lead to an underground railroad?
No. I couldn't tell what was inside. It was pitch black beyond the edges of the bookcases, but ironically, a piece of Stable-Tech technology would shed some light. I turned on my pip-buck lamp and walked in slowly with my carbine rifle at the ready. I didn't have far to walk. It only took me a few steps to see the portrait again. The secret room was long and thin, not much wider than a hallway. It was clearly planned and concealed by the false wall that ran along the north side of the library. I began following the wall as my pip-buck lamp illuminated only a few feet in front of me. The first thing I came across was a desk that had an assortment of books and papers on it. Mixed among them were pages of sheet music for the organ. The room was some kind of hidden workspace kept by Crescendo. The books themselves explained why the room was hidden behind Oakroot's portrait. All of the writings were related to runic magics of various kinds. Apart from Oakroot's work, there were volumes related to the talisman magics of the native pony cultures, Saddle Arabian tablet spells, buffalo curses, giraffe incantations. It appeared that Crescendo was studying every kind of magic from every culture, including several spellbooks on the glyph magic created by the zebras.
It sounds like he was toying with dangerous forces. Each one of those are powerful enough on their own. What was he intending on doing with all of them together?
He was clearly looking for something specific. He had notes and markings scribbled in the borders of the pages. The walls were covered in hoof-written sheets where he was combining the different kinds of spells together in different ways. I could identify bits and pieces of Manchester magic, but most of it was completely foreign to me. I was getting more and more anxious. The pages seemed to get less coherent the further I went into the room. The sheets were more crumpled or torn, and the markings were written in heavier pen, sometimes puncturing through the page. I also began seeing an increase in the number of zebra glyphs he was using. It had reached the point where they were the dominant form of magic he was experimenting with. Finally, I reached the end of the room. Sitting there, in front of the last wall, was a shrine that even raiders would find horrific. It rose from the floor in a frame made of bones, but not just bones. They had been carved into and covered in gems of various shapes and sizes. Each gem was etched with its own symbol. All of the gems touched, each through a yellowish sap of some kind which ran through all the skeletal pieces like marrow. Holding the abomination together were sections of dried leathery skin. In the center of the shrine was a bowl of thick, brownish-black ooze. It was some kind of liquid solution which had evaporated over time, leaving only the foul-smelling muck behind. Rising out of the bowl of ooze was a preserved and mummified head. The skin was covered in symbols in various colors, and the muscles had distorted to the point that I couldn't even tell if it came from a pony or zebra. It sat there, staring up at me with its lifeless eyes. I walked backwards slowly, too shaken to turn my back to the monstrosity. It grew dark as I stepped away from it, until finally I galloped quickly out of the hidden doorway and vomited.
By the goddesses!
What in all that is holy had he done? All the different bones and skin. Several creatures had died to make that altar, not to mention the head. Was this the big surprise Harpsichord had mentioned? Did she know about this? Were they all involved? The thoughts swirled in my brain like a swarm of angry bees. Once I composed myself, I noticed how dark everything had become. The sun had totally disappeared over the horizon. If it weren't for the cloud barrier, I would have been able to see the stars in the sky. It was in that small moment of darkness that I was suddenly deafened. A mighty roar echoed through the hallways. It happened so quickly that only when I uncovered my ears did I realize what the sound was. What I thought was a cacophony of shrieks and howls, I soon recognized as a melody traveling through the house. The pipes of the massive organ called out as if they were the voices of the earth itself. Instinctively, I drew out my rifle and hovered it in the direction of the organ. There was a long pause. Nothing else was happening. The instrument simply bellowed its song, which seemed to shake the walls. Then I saw a faint glow beginning to appear at the end of the hallway. I yelled out in my most authoritative voice, "Halt! Don't move!" The glow continued to get closer and closer. "Stop!" I cried again. My pipbuck light was casting a green-tinged glow around the edge of the hallway, so whether or not the pony could hear me over the organ shouldn't have mattered. As it continued moving through the hallway, the candelabras beside the portraits would ignite as it passed by. The passage was slowly accented with dim orange candle flames. They hardly stood out, though, because what came into view was an irradiant, pony-shaped being, glowing with a bright lavender light. I decided I had waited enough. The SAT's targeting spell appeared in my vision. I took aim at the creature's head and fired. The .44 Magnum bullet exploded out of the barrel of my carbine rifle and sailed through the air. In a fraction of a second, it reached its target and passed right through. The pony continued its slow trot towards me, another set of candles lighting on either side of it. I cocked the lever and fired another round, this time through its chest. Once again, the bullet failed to slow it at all, passing through what should have been its heart, lung, stomach, and tail.
Was it a hologram of some kind?
I had covered almost the whole mansion before that, and hadn't seen any holographic projectors, just a few security cameras placed in different spots. The creature had almost reached the library now. I was stepping back further into the room, angling to the right to see if it had a weak spot on its side. I fired one more time where its eye would be. The lead projectile flew through the creature and struck the frame of one of the portraits behind it. Bits of wood cracked and splintered as it flew through the air. It was the sound of the picture frame hitting the ground that finally caused the creature to stop. In a momentary pause, I took a good look at it. The being was roughly the size of an average adult mare. She was transparent. I could easily see through her purple-tinted frame. The outline of her body glowed the brightest lavender shade, but every inch of her gave off some light. The outline was not perfectly defined, though. The edges of her mane and tail seemed to be flowing, so to speak, as if her hair was pouring down, then swirling around and flowing back into her head. The bottom of her hooves were the same way. The edges of her fetlocks poured down into what looked like a cloud at the bottom of each ankle. While looking at her feet, I noticed one of her back legs was breaking apart. The outer side of the leg poured off like smoke from a chimney. The cloud trailed along the floor towards the picture frame. I looked up and saw that a similar smoke had begun pouring out of the bullet hole where I had shot through the portrait. The smoke poured over the place on the wall that the picture once covered. Inscribed behind the frame was one of the strange magical glyphs. It glowed just as brightly as the phantom that stood before me.
Phantom? You mean like a ghost? A disembodied spirit? They could easily have been some kind of enchantment or decoy spell.
I didn't know what else to think of them. I was sure I was staring at one of the souls that were slain to make that altar of bones. Horrible visions filled my head of Crescendo sneaking off in the middle of the night to raid villages for bodies, whether they were dead or alive. Soon the amorphous cloud began to take shape, lifting the broken picture as its limbs and head flowed from the center. A second, fully formed spectre had materialized. It held the portrait in its hoof, still splintered and twisted from the gunshot. But from the creature's hoof flowed out more of the glowing cloud. It covered the frame and began pulling it back together, as if time were moving in reverse. Every splinter returned to its place, until the portrait was whole once again. It was not exactly the same, though. Lavender scars remained where the wood had been stitched back together. The bullet hole in the wall had mended itself as well. The pony holding it returned the picture to its rightful place. Both phantoms stared at it for a long moment. Then, in perfect unison, they both turned to face me.
Oh, and I'm not going to sleep tonight.
They both entered the library, following me as I fired a few more times and galloped down one of the aisles. They were not fast. Their walk wasn't much faster than a canter. Although walking doesn't really describe how they moved, their legs made walking motions, but the clouds at their heels blurred together into a single amorphous trail that they glided on. Their leg motions didn't even sync up with their speed, so it looked as if they were moving much slower than they actually were. The candles in the chandeliers above us were set alight as the phantoms passed beneath them. They were closing in on me from two sides, driving me into a corner. I felt a bump as my tail was pressed up against the observation window. Using the butt of my rifle, I pounded on the glass, trying to break it. I struck it several times, but it failed to even crack. Panicking, I quickly inscribed an explosion spell on the glass, the same one I had used to get through the front gate. With a spark, the runes glowed bright orange and erupted. The force knocked me backwards into one of the couches. Looking up, I watched as the glass expanded outward in a million tiny shards. But instead of toppling to the ground below, they stayed connected together through an arcing streaks of purple energy. As soon as my spell dissipated, the shards were pulled back into place as quickly as they were dislodged. The window had completely resealed, this time looking like the stained glass window of an ancient cathedral.
It just fused itself back together?
Like it had been designed that way, as a purple web. I stood on the couch with my mouth agape and pupils the size of pinpricks. In my shock, I failed to notice one of the phantoms approaching to my left. I spun my head just as its arm reached for my left hind leg. The moment it touched my boot, the leather began to burn like it was tossed into a fire. I recoiled backwards and used the leverage on the couch to jump over the other phantom. My boot continued to sizzle, so I quickly ripped it off with magic and galloped down the hallway. The organ was still playing as loudly as ever. When I reached the staircases, I looked over the banister as I ran down. Out of the flues of the organ's pipes, the lavender smoke poured out like a waterfall. It collected in front of the organ like a morning fog. The gold power lever had been switched back on. The keys and pedals of the instrument seemed to play on their own or under influence of the glowing purple smoke flowing over them. Once reaching the bottom of the stairs, I ran for the front door, praying that I'd be able to escape there. I pulled on the handles with all my might, But even with every muscle and every bit of magic in my body, I simply couldn't get them to budge. I spun around, looking for any other exits I could find. All around me, more and more of the phantoms came filing in from the hallways. They had the atrium surrounded and forced me away from the doors. I galloped back and forth trying to find an opening, but they just kept coming. They closed me in until I was caught between the backs of the staircases and the pipe organ.
How many of them were there?
Dozens. They came down the stairs, all 4 hallways. I couldn't even vault over them like I had before because the circle was at least 2 creatures deep. It felt as though they were trying to force me into the cloud that had collected in front of the organ. I stared at it in fear as a shape began rising out of the cloud. All of the smoke gathered together around the keys of the organ, rising like ash from a volcano. It took form as 2 arms and a head flowing out from the pipes as they continued to play. Unlike the beings that surrounded me, this creature stared at me with 2 bright red eyes, which glowed like the balls of energy at the top of a dynamo. I stepped back as the creature began to lean closer to me. It was then that I felt a wave of unimaginable pain overtake my leg, the one without a boot. I jerked away as the whiff of lavender smoke reformed the arm of one of the phantoms. A long patch between my ankle and knee was sizzling as the purple cloud continued to seep off of it. All of the hair had been burned off in an instant, and my skin was sickly and oozing down 3 layers. I barely stumbled a few feet when I collapsed, my leg burning with every flex of the muscle. I was laying on my side with my legs suspended in the air as jolts of pain continued to shoot up my spine. My dress had been bunched up from the fall, leaving my flank and tail uncovered. In an instant, the organ had stopped playing. The creature floating before it was no longer looking me in the eye, but was transfixed by my mark. The royal seal of Manchester, which was now exposed for all to see. The quiet was so unsettling that even in my pain I noticed the absence of the organ. The horror loomed above me, its face twisting and retching as its ghostly jaw pulled open. It let out a wail so terrible it sounded like the dying screams of 1,000 different creatures. Even the other phantoms seemed to recoil at the horror's cry. I staggered backwards in terror, the burn on my leg becoming comparatively tolerable. I was backed up against the door of one of the locked closets behind the stairs. The horror continued to wail as the organ began sounding as well. Several keys played a horrible, discordant sound. I was still slumped on the floor and started reaching up for anything I could to grab onto so I could get back on my feet. I took hold of the door handle, but as I tugged at it, the door opened up behind me and I tumbled backwards down a staircase.
So, is this the part where you tell me that they ate your soul and you've come here to haunt Ten Pony Tower?
Shh, don't spoil the ending. Why do you presume I'd haunt you?
There's nothing to presume. If you hung around here with ghostly dressmaking skills, I wouldn't have a cap to my name as long as Homage is here.
Well, I'll have to keep that in mind for later. They say you can't take anything with you, but that'd be a moot point if I stayed here.
We could call you the Ghost of Fabulosity Past, and you could frighten us all with your attempts at singing holiday songs.
Oh, you are so getting haunted now.
But I guess that'll have to wait, because it doesn't sound like you broke your neck on that tumble down the stairs.
Luckily, no. When I reached the bottom, besides a few bruises, the only thing really damaged was my leg. While I was alarmed that someone had unlocked the door, I was grateful that the closet ended up leading to a cellar. It was the change of luck I needed. I rolled to a stop against a tall wooden rack that went to the ceiling. My body, bumping against it, made a distinctive clinking sound. The wooden rack was full of wine bottles, all adorned with the same Maracello labels I had seen on the empty ones in the bedroom. When I opened my eyes, I saw something else familiar. Sticking out from an empty wine slot was one of the strange batteries the traveling couple had brought with them. I magically pulled on it and felt something much heavier come with it. The battery was attached to what looked like a pistol. It plugged into one side of the mouth grip, which was then connected to the barrel with some wiring. I spun the pistol around a few times, getting a good look at it. The gauge on the barrel was too small for any kind of bullets, so my first thought was that it was some kind of battery-powered BB gun. On the side of the gun, someone had carved the warning, "Do not aim at face."
I love some of the names people will come up with for their guns.
Despite my partial daze and fascination with the toy, I realized that one of the phantoms had followed me down the stairs. I yelped and aimed the gun at the creature out of instinct. With the press of the trigger, I fired right into its face. But instead of a small copper BB, the gun exploded with a beam of bright yellow light. The blast was blinding and hot. I had to shield my eyes.
That is definitely not a toy.
As I stood up, I faced the creature. There was a hole through the phantom's head, as if someone had punched a hoof through it. The laser beam had blown away half its face at a single shot. The phantom had even been pushed back a few feet.
That really is the beauty of energy weapons. They might be rare, but they pack a wallop.
My satisfaction didn't last, though. Within moments, small sparks of energy began surging around the hole as the purple cloud started filling it back in. Not wasting any time, I hobbled deeper into the wine cellar. I ran as fast as I could without my leg giving out from under me. I was surrounded by wine bottles on all sides. In any other circumstance, it would have been a dream come true.
Ain't that the truth?
But I couldn't indulge in that fantasy because behind each wine rack was another one of the mortified zebra glyphs. I kept moving until I came to a pneumatic door marked Generator Room. I tapped on the panel, but it didn't open. I tried to open it manually, but the lever wouldn't budge.
It's just like I said, those pneumatic doors always jam up at the worst possible moments.
I pounded on the lever a few more times, but had to give up. I saw the purple smoke start to pour down from the ceiling, so I kept running along the wall, looking for another door.
Why didn't you just blow it open with another rune spell?
I didn't have the energy. Even basic runic spells take a lot out of you. I was using whatever latent energy I could just to keep the weight off my leg. I didn't even have enough to keep the laser pistol floating. I had to hold it in my mouth. I turned the corner at the end of that hallway of wine bottles and found my exit. Between 4 big fermentation tanks was a large metal door that had been slid open. It looked like a barn door, but was made out of the same bunker-grade titanium that Stable 79 was made of. Unfortunately, one of the phantoms had just finished forming and was going to beat me to it. So I triggered my Pip-Buck's targeting spell and fired. My aim was a bit off, but the laser still blasted right through its neck. With one more shot, I could have taken its head off. I kept stumbling until I made it through the titanium barn door. Another of the phantoms was right behind me, so I tried to fire again. I pressed the trigger with my tongue, but heard only a pathetic click. The battery was dead. I struggled to pull out the other one I had placed in my saddlebag, but in my haste, I lost focus on my leg and fell again from a jolt of pain. I turned towards the creature as it reached out to grab me, but as its leg passed through the door's boundary, the luminescent light that formed its body disappeared. The radiant glow flickered out like a candle flame under a glass. The creature jolted to a halt as we both watched its leg float to the ceiling like a harmless puff of smoke. The phantom backed up a few steps to let its leg reform, and then it tried coming through head first, but as it passed through the frame of the door, it dissolved away inch by inch. The smoke from the creature's body floated to the ceiling and dissipated as it mixed with the rest of the air in the room. I gazed out from the 10 by 10 foot opening and saw nearly a dozen other phantoms staring blankly. They didn't try to approach me, they just looked at the spot where the first creature had vaporized.
What on earth was going on?
I glanced around the room I was standing in. It definitely looked like the entrance to a stable. There was a computer terminal at roughly the same spot, and there were pressurization pumps that surrounded the door's seal. The room had some metal plating on the walls, but most of it was still bare, exposing the structural framework underneath. The only thing missing were the zebra glyphs. None of the walls beyond the opening to the door were marked in any way.
Well, at least I can sleep a little better tonight.
It was then that I heard the organ play another distorted note, and I decided I'd seen enough. I entered the only hallway, getting as far away from Maracello as I could. The corridor quickly turned pitch black. I didn't have the ambient purple glow from the wall glyphs or phantoms anymore. I turned on my Pip-Buck light and stopped as soon as I reached the next room. I assumed I was far enough out of their reach, so I sat down to tend to my leg. I carefully leaned against the wall and levitated a box under my left hind hoof to keep the leg suspended. I pulled my dress away and felt a horrible pain as the sticky exposed skin clung to the fabric. I tilted my pip-buck lamp to get a good look at it. The wound was similar to a third-degree burn. 2 of the layers of skin had been seared away while the ones below it had swelled and bubbled. I took out my antiseptic cream and coated the entire burned area, which covered everything basically from my tarsus joint to my fetlocks.
So basically half of the leg, Professor?
Yes. The cream hurt at first, but then the burning sensation went away and it felt better. I wrapped the wound with some healing bandages, which I hoped would work well enough. Finally, I took a big swig of vodka and ripped my dress off.
Once again, quite the party under different circumstances.
I'll say, but I wasn't thinking of anything like that at the time. All I wanted to do was sleep. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was. I had been up almost 24 hours while looking for the mansion, and had been through a very traumatic experience. I looked at my motion sensor and didn't detect anything in the area. So I set up a proximity alarm that would go off if anything came too close. I then reloaded my carbine rifle and the laser pistol, and fell asleep using my dress as a pillow.
And you actually slept well like that?
I did. It was warm and comfortable down there because the weather in the swamplands was perpetually 75 degrees and humid. Although no longer being chased by a poltergeist definitely helped. I ended up sleeping for 12 straight hours, which did wonders for my leg. I stood up on all fours and was feeling much better. I could actually walk on my leg again. I changed the bandages and realized that it was already well past sunrise. I started thinking to myself, all of this mess started with sunset, so maybe they only exist at night. Wanting to prove my theory, I crept slowly back up the hallway with my pip-buck light off, trying as hard as I could not to make a sound. I reached the entrance room and saw rays of sunlight coming in from a cellar window. I walked up to the computer terminal at the center of the room, right next to the loading dock. The cellar looked totally clear. There weren't any phantoms, and I didn't see any of the glowing glyphs on the wall. Still, though, I didn't trust it. Something was gnawing at me in the back of my mind, so I pulled out my carbine and fired a shot. 2 of the wine bottles outside of the door exploded in a splash of red and purple. That's when I saw 2 faint glows on each side of the metal doorway. The noses of 2 phantoms turned towards the sound, then quickly turned away.
They were going to ambush you from each side of the door? Clever girls.
It didn't bode well for me, though. There was no way I was leaving through the front door, even if there were fewer phantoms than before. So, I went with my only safe option. I turned on my pip-buck lamp and walked back down the hallway. The room where I slept was a lobby. There were several openings for lifts, but there were no cars in any of the shafts. Luckily, a large staircase circled down around the shafts, so I started walking down the empty concrete steps. I noticed that I was leaving hoofprints behind me. All of the walls and floors were coated in a fine purple dust. I walked down about 5 stories before reaching the bottom. It looked like Crescendo wasn't kidding when he said he'd do anything to save his family, because it looked like he has stolen a lot of bunker designs from Stable-Tech to make his own stable. There were 2 hallways that branched out into male and female living quarters. One hallway had game rooms and other recreational activities, including an indoor hoofball court. One hallway led to some shops and mechanical rooms. Of course, none of the areas were finished. Most of them weren't much more than wall struts and loose electrical wiring. There were overhead lighting fixtures, but none of them had power, which was odd because the last hallway had a distinct purple glow.
Oh, goddesses, not again.
I pulled out my laser pistol and trotted slowly towards the hallway. The word atrium was written in painter's tape above the doorframe. When I got close enough to read it, I heard a click. Then another click. Then another. I glanced down at my pip-buck and noticed the rad meter was starting to rise. Something in there was radioactive. Knowing I had nowhere else to go, I took a deep breath and walked in. What I saw, I have to say, was probably the last thing I expected.
Well, what was it?
Sorry, I was pausing for dramatic effect.
Well, it looks like someone's become quite the radio personality. But with a pause like that, I thought you wanted me to go to the phones. Which is weird because this isn't a call-in show. I mean, it's not like we could poll the listeners to hear their guesses. You know what? We'll do just that. All you listeners out there in post-apocalyptia, take out a piece of paper and write down what you think is in the atrium. Then go out and put it in some random mailbox. I know there's at least one mail-mare left in the Wasteland. We'll be right back.
What's wrong, little filly?
Hi, mister. I'm sad because all my friends are better than me at Catch the Zebra. I'll never win.
Well, cheer up, little missy, because I have just the thing. A patented stable deck Pitbuck 1000.
Cool!
The Pitbuck 1000 is a state-of-the-art terminal that you can wear on your leg, complete with terrain mapping, built-in lamp, and eyes forward sparkle. A built-in locator spell that can help you track both friend and zebra alike.
That's perfect, mister! You zebras can't hide from me now!
The Pitbuck 1000, now available from StableTech, built for the future.
And we're back.
Did you just cut to commercial?
Yeah, I've still got a whole bunch of these saved up from before the war. I like to break them out whenever it feels appropriate.
Fine. Jerk.
So, now we've returned to Confessions of a Wasteland Pony, where the Duchess has jumped out of the ghostly purple frying pan into the radioactive purple fire. Tell us, Rose Petal, what did you find in the atrium?
Well, I feared the worst. I was expecting another collection of phantoms who were then going to drive me back up the corridor into the mansion again, like I was being toyed with. As I looked out over the railing, though, I saw something I never expected. Staring up at me from the glowing purple abyss was the nose of a locomotive. Behind it were 4 other train cars which had twisted and crushed into one another. There was a gaping hole in the atrium's wall where the train had apparently come crashing through.
So, wait, there really was an underground railroad? I was just joking.
This wasn't a standard passenger train. Each car was emblazoned with the royal seal, and the locomotive had the markings of the Ministry of Arcane Science. This was a military train. Besides the locomotive, all 4 of the other cars looked like oil tankers, but instead of oil, they were each filled with a bright, glowing purple liquid. All of the containers had burst open from the collision and filled up the atrium in at least 2 feet of radioactive substance. I could still see a noticeable lavender haze rising out of the pool. My rad counter was ticking away very quickly at this point. Even using the catwalks around the atrium was getting a bit too close.
Yes, at this point, our listeners should understand that swimming in mysterious glowing liquid is a bad thing.
I wanted to risk the catwalk, though, because on the other side of the atrium, I saw what should be the Overmare's office. So I quickly trotted across the walkway that hadn't been destroyed by the train. Once I got over there, it was pretty close to what I had expected. While not exactly like our Overmare's office, the room looked like the best counterfeit that corporate espionage could buy. The office looked like the main builder of the stable was using it as a workstation. Around the room were a bunch of drawings and other blueprints from a bunch of small companies I'd never heard of. One table had a hoof-written note with a bunch of to-do items. At the bottom of the list it said, "Call Project Superintendent." While blasting for the foundation, we broke through the wall of an old water tunnel. No flooding came through, so we believe it's dried up. We are putting up a temporary wall just in case. How should we proceed? I glanced out of one of the windows that looked into the atrium. The nose of the locomotive was almost touching the edge of the catwalk. It was crushed on one side, like it had collided with the wreckage on the track and was forcibly derailed. Water tunnel. Sure, I said to myself.
Pretty much.
On the Overmare's desk was another one of the East Corp terminals, like I had seen in the main mansion, and unlike the rest of the stable, it had power. There were thick blue power and data lines connected to the terminal from the ceiling. I was really hoping that this doppelganger stable copied one final aspect of the Overmare's office. I tapped through the menu and found what I was looking for, an emergency exit. Stable 79 and many others, from what I've seen, all have a secret passageway that's made for the Overmare to use in case of emergencies. The only variable was where the exit led to. Some of them led to the main stable door, which would not help me in this case. However, some of them were connected to an alternate entrance, like an old cave system that the stable was built inside of. I clicked the key to open the emergency escape tunnel. A small array of blue light started glowing in one corner of the room. Then out of the ceiling descended a thick metal tube which touched down on the floor and spun open. It looked a lot like those stupid preservation shelters that they put up on some of the street corners before the war. I forget what they were called. We always called them the lifts to hell.
So, did it seem better that this one dropped from the ceiling instead of up from the ground? Maybe it would take you to heaven instead.
Not exactly. When the lift opened, the terminal screen cut to a security camera view of the other side. The video feed showed the master bedroom. The other side of the lift had risen up from the floor between the terminal and the bed.
Which is still inside the mansion.
I should have figured as much. This room wasn't meant for an Overmare at all. It was only meant for one person, Crescendo. So, that was it. I was dead. There wasn't any other way out. I would either starve to death in the blackness of the stable, die of radiation poisoning, or go back to the mansion and be burned alive by the poltergeist. That unearthly wail started playing in my head again, sounding less like a scream and more like laughter. I covered my ears and dropped my head down on the keyboard, trying to make it stop. The terminal made a strange beep when my forehead touched down on the keys. I lifted my head back up. The camera feed was no longer playing the live video, and had instead cut to a previously recorded clip. The video showed the bedroom door opening, with the travelling couple walking inside. The mare looked very excited. She dropped her bags on the ground and dived onto the queen bed. She stretched out to enjoy every inch of the soft mattress.
Well, at least you had some TV to watch while you slowly starved to death.
Then the stallion joined her.
Or perhaps pay-per-view.
I skipped ahead of the celebration.
Sure you did.
And when it was over, I watched as the stallion left the room. While she was a unicorn, he was an earth pony, so he walked out holding the laser pistol in his teeth. When he returned, he had 2 bottles of wine in his mouth and no laser pistol. They finished the bottles pretty quickly and proceeded to round 2. They had gotten a little too comfortable and a little too drunk, which are 2 things that can get you killed in the Wasteland.
But at least it gave you a superpowered accessory.
A later video showed the stallion connecting his pip-buck to the terminal, which resulted in a bright flash and sparks. He fell backwards off the chair with his arm on fire. He rolled around a few times, but it wasn't extinguished until the girl poured water over it. He was pretty badly burnt. She bandaged it as best she could, but he looked really weak after that. They soon fell asleep on the bed. I noticed because the video recording stopped and skipped forward a few hours. The cameras must have been motion activated. The next video showed them being startled awake and looking at the bedroom door. The mare had her laser pistol floated up next to her, and the stallion realized what he had done. In a frenzy, he picked up a butcher's knife. She approached the door, and he hobbled as fast as he could right behind her. They must have been woken up by the pipe organ, because the purple smoke started pouring out of the walls, and 2 phantoms formed in the bedroom next to them. The mare fired a shot through each of them, then the couple ran out the bedroom door.
What happened next?
I don't know. The next video it cut to was me walking through the bedroom door. I went back through the directory and changed views. The terminal was wired into several different cameras. There was one at the entrance of the fake stable. There was one at the door going outside from the kitchen. There was one in the master bedroom where the emergency entrance is, and there was a camera at the front door of the mansion. The front door camera was the only other one that recorded them. The couple entered Maracello around noon. Then around 8 p.m., the door opened one more time. The girl ran out of there as fast as she could, by herself. In the distance, a bright light shone as she welded the front gate together in a moment of passion and pain. The next clip cut to 5 years later, with me blasting a hole through that very same gate. Despite all the warnings, I was stupid enough to go inside. Even the mutated animals are smart enough to avoid the mansion. At least they can sense the evil that's inside.
There's no way you could have known.
I flipped through a few more of the clips to see how far back they went. One of the first things recorded dated back over 200 years, even before Doomsday. Crescendo was standing in front of the fake stable entrance addressing several dozen family members who had all made it for the fall festival. Harpsichord and the rest of the immediate family were standing in the front beside him. He was pointing to different features on the door and talking very enthusiastically. Harpsichord and the others did not look as amused. Her mother was drinking a very large glass of wine as he spoke. I was starting to doubt that the family were involved with the dark magic that Crescendo had been dabbling in. That could be why the zebra glyphs were hidden behind the wine racks and the family portraits, so the family wouldn't see what he's doing. Perhaps this fake stable was the big surprise that Crescendo had been preparing, the one Harpsichord had talked about.
No kidding. He was an ill-tempered father who was quickly losing his mind to the war, among other things. That kind of person putting his family through round-the-clock construction below their house? No wonder they were stressed. It probably took all of Harpsichord's will just to keep them together.
Unfortunately for them, there was one more big surprise that none of them were expecting. While Crescendo was still talking, the whole cellar started to shake. The wine bottles rattled around and all the family members had to stumble to keep their footing. Crescendo looked down, then turned toward the stable entrance. He took a few steps closer and was overwhelmed by a burst of glowing smoke. Within seconds, the entire cellar was covered in the haze, but the smoke still kept pouring in, forcing itself upward and slowly filling the mansion above. The containers on the train cars must have been highly pressurized to explode and vaporize like that. I don't know what the Ministry of Arcane Science was transporting, but it dissolved the flesh off of their bones faster than I could even watch. It was just like when the Phantom grabbed my leg, except everywhere. After a minute or so, the haze finally cleared away enough that you could see their bodies. They were nothing but skeletons. Some of them were even still standing upright, having been vaporized in place. I couldn't look anymore. I closed down the video and wept. This was the answer to my question. This is what had become of the Oratorios. Burned alive at a family reunion, a time that should be for celebration and togetherness. And it all happened before the bombs fell. They didn't have the chance to make it into a stable, or even the fake one that Crescendo was building. That was the first time that I felt the true cruelty and despair of the Wasteland. I had been lucky up until that point. I had made it through some close calls, whether they were battles with slavers or fights against giant animals, but now my luck had run out. I was going to die alone, in the dark, being surrounded by the fact that I had done this to myself through my own curiosity and self-righteousness. I had left the safety of home, the closeness of the family I loved and who loved me. Sure, they weren't perfect, and maybe we had lived blissfully ignorant of some of the worst things our ancestors had done. But who doesn't? Who doesn't climb up their family tree without finding bad apples or even whole branches that are wilted and sickly? All I could think of were my parents and siblings, my cousins and friends, and everyone else in New Manchester. I was going to die alone, deep underground, thinking I would never see them again. I thought back on my quest, on why I had come in the first place. I pulled out the 13th tome written by Oakroot the Silent, on race, equality, and magic. I read through the opening chapters again, thinking back to Oakroot's teachings, his dreams and plans for what would become of the Chamber of Nine and the Foggy Isles, a new government of the people working together towards freedom, equality, and order. I stopped crying and got up. I was probably dead anyway, so I might as well try to finish what I had started.
Now that sounds like the rose petal I know.
I marched back up to the stable door and called out into the cellar. I know you're there! You and you beside the door! The two phantoms stepped out from the sides into full view and looked at me. Their empty eye sockets seemed distant and only vaguely aware. Crescendo, where are you? I know you're listening! There was a moment of pause, and then a column of cloud started pouring down from the ceiling. The two phantoms before me began breaking down and collapsing into amorphous blobs. They floated away and joined with the column of cloud to form a new body, one that stood a head taller than any of the others. A few arcs of red lightning surged down the column of smoke which stayed anchored to the ceiling. The arcs of energy eventually settled in the creature's eyes. The horror bent its neck down toward me, waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath and started. My name is Rose Petal. I am the current Duchess of Manchester. I am next in line for the throne behind my cousin, the sitting regent, Duke Highwater. In the years after the Great War, we have risen our land from the ashes to build a new Manchester. And with our new chance at life, we want to be completely reborn as a people. I came searching for you to bring restoration to our family. I floated out Oakroot's 13th tome. I did not know this existed before arriving here. Our ancestors took that knowledge from us, but I want to bring it back. I want to change our people so that we can move forward, learning from the mistakes of our fathers and mothers so we don't make the same ones again. He looked down at me through ghostly eyes, listening intently. I know how much you care for your family too, and to what lengths you went through to protect them. I don't know if there's anything I could do for you now, but I'd be willing to try. All I ask is that you let me go. He still didn't move. Please, what do you want me to do? That caused him to tilt his head. He looked off to one side as if he was thinking. I was hopeful for a moment. Then I heard a creaking sound in the direction he was glancing. The pneumatic door to the generator room slid open behind one of the wine racks. I took a step forward. Did he want me to go that way? But before I could take another step, I started hearing hoofsteps. Someone walked out of the door, and it slid shut behind them. His pace was slow. Clip, clop, clip, clop. I could barely make out a shadow from behind the wine bottles. Then, as he got closer, he came into view. The skeleton of an adult buck walked slowly down the main aisle, being puppeted forward by a glowing cloud. A partially melted pip-bug rattled around its front leg.
The stallion from the traveling couple.
It walked closer and closer to me. The cloud disappeared as it passed through the doorway, dumping his bones on the floor in front of me. Crescendo had given me his answer. The apparition screamed with another ghostly wail, and I bowed my head in defeat. I looked at the skull. It reminded me of the altar of bones Crescendo had constructed in the secret room of his library. That is all he was now, the sorcerer. In his bigotry and hatred, he had become the very monster that his ancestors were depicted as so long ago. He even found his own chalice stone. The phantom continued to wail as the organ started playing again, the same haunting tune it had since the very beginning. I glanced down behind him and noticed that we weren't alone. In a far corner of the cellar, I saw another set of eyes, two glowing green lights staring at us from a distance.
Someone else was down there with you?
I looked back at them for several seconds. Then, as Crescendo's body started breaking down into the smaller phantoms, the other eyes winked out as well. I looked down at the bones of the stallion, and was filled with hope again. For every sorcerer, there was a stone heart, and for every dead traveller, there was one who escaped. I rushed back down to the emergency lift and prepared myself. I wrapped my leg with another set of bandages, I reloaded my laser pistol with the last battery, and I took another swig of vodka.
Ha ha, that a girl.
I closed the door and rode the lift back up into the mansion. Once the tube opened, I jumped out and picked up all the extra laser pistol batteries from the box the travellers had left behind. Then I opened the bedroom door and started running. One phantom had already materialized in the hallway, so I blasted through its head and continued down the stairs. I circled down the staircase and shot through another phantom that was waiting for me at the bottom. It slid out of the way, and I galloped to the front doors. I blasted both the door handles with a shot from the laser pistol. Sparks of purple crackled away from the metal hydras. If the lasers can disrupt phantoms for a few seconds, they must be able to disrupt the energy field around the house, too. With my magic and both legs, I pulled on the door handle and felt it creaking open toward me. I could see sunlight. Inch by inch, the heavy oak door pulled open. I could almost get my leg through. Behind me, I heard the organ falling out of its song, descending into random strikes on the keys as crescendo wailed from the flowing smoke. The door was almost open when arcs of red energy started surging between the cracks, closing it again. I pulled with all my might. My bandaged leg was pressed against the door with the last of my strength and every bit of magic I could conjure. But with a final boom, the door slammed shut. I crumpled to the floor, still holding on to the metal handles. Nearly a dozen of the phantoms surrounded me now, closing in from all sides. I shut my eyes and waited for the end. But in that moment, I heard the organ stop playing, and Crescendo's wail quieted down to a whimper. I opened my eyes again to see that the phantoms had stopped. In fact, they started backing away. Only one of the creatures remained in its place. It stood between me and the pipe organ. Behind it, Crescendo's spectral body floated limply above the keys of the organ. The red glow in his eyes was faded and almost non-existent. Before me was a single glowing purple body, a lavender envelope of energy holding the mysterious cloud inside. Then, green sparks started manifesting around it. The bolts of energy circled the body, giving it a smaller frame and finer details to the neck and face. The arcs eventually settled into two balls of glowing green energy set inside of almond-shaped eyes. "Harpsichord," I whispered, tears rolling down my face. She was a shadow of her former self, a restless soul that had been anchored to this world through science and dark magic. She raised her leg toward me, and a surge of green energy erupted around the door. With a creak, the heavy wooden slab pulled away, revealing a peaceful, foggy morning. I stepped through the doorframe and turned around. "Thank you," I told her. She stared up at me from her petite stature, and like a true southern belle, she curtsied. I trotted down the steps, and the door slid shut behind me.
What an incredible tale! You've been keeping that story from me all these years?
I guess there's just something about a microphone that makes you want to open up. Now I can see why you've been in radio all these years.
And here you told me that purple patch on your leg was a birthmark. So, what happened next? Did you just leave?
I walked back through the hole I had exploded in the front gate, and welded it shut again. I also placed a runic spell on the fence, something called Insight. Whenever someone touches one of the iron bars, they'll be shown a vision of what's inside. It basically gives them a dose of the worst fear I experienced in there.
With a runic spell, too. Quite fitting.
After that, I travelled straight for Manchester, although I did make a quick stop at Victo to delete Maracello's location from the information terminal. I try to do that whenever I can, to dissuade any travellers or treasure seekers.
Hopefully your story will ward off any reckless adventurers. Let the ghosts of Maracello rest in peace.
I hope so too. After that experience, I wanted nothing less than to see my family again. Once I got off the ferry, I told the story to everyone on the island. At first, many of them thought I was making it up or was delusional from some kind of wasteland sickness. But when I showed them Okrut's 13th book, they believed.
I'm sure they did. The proof is in the literary pudding.
Since then, we've spent the last decade making meaningful changes to New Manchester. My adventuring led to more of the islanders wanting to travel to the mainland, and from that, we've opened up a major trading market. That gave me the opportunity to continue my quest to beautify the Wasteland, travelling around Equestria while still being able to return home often and stay connected to my roots. Thanks to those new lines of commerce, we were able to gather our own records and books so that we could fully include the Oratorio family histories right beside our own. We remember them for what they were: builders, businessmen, musicians, great stallions and mares of all races. But for them, and us, we chronicle the bad as well. We remember the bigots, the sorcerers, the villains. Because, with every age and every season, we are nothing if not the legacy of days past. We remember history as it was, so that each individual has the tools and the knowledge they need so that they can write their own story the way that they like, the way that's right.
Which is ultimately what's best for us all. You see, children, history is not something that we can pick and choose based on what we want to remember. It is what it is. It's the sequence of events that led up to today. Every spring and every harvest, every celebration and every funeral, every age of peace and every time of war. If you limit your knowledge of the past, you are in danger of what's to come in the future. Because it's only in full understanding of the past that we can actually learn from it and live better tomorrow. Because how can we build a better future if our foundation is full of holes? But at the same time, don't waste the present by being too focused on what's to come. No matter what, DJ Pony's going to be here to tell you the truth, no matter how bad it hurts. So don't worry about tomorrow. Live for today. Enjoy all the great things and great people that life has to offer.
I think that's a rule we can all live by.
So, thank you once again to our esteemed guest and new neighbor, Rose Petal, the Duchess of Manchester.
Why, thank you, my dear. It has been an absolute delight.
Who still holds the title of chattiest pony in Ten Pony Tower.
Excuse me?
Every story must come to an end. I wish I could tell you more. We've had our sadness and we've had our fun, something we can't ignore. And though we may fly to the east and the west, and distance may keep us apart,